Good morning or afternoon, wherever you are. If you're just joining, there is a trivia question on the screen. You're going to have to go to slido.com to answer it. We've started a couple minutes early to give you a chance to answer this question, and then we'll get started as people roll in. So thanks for joining, and we'll get started in just a minute. While you wait, go to slido.com, enter the event code hashtag or #, depending on how you know that symbol, DOE, and answer the trivia question. Again, if you've just joined, welcome. Thank you for coming. We're letting folks trickle in. While you wait, there's a trivia question on your screen. To answer it, go to slido.com and enter the event code hashtag DOE. You should be able to answer that question. I think I'll give maybe just a minute more for folks to join, and then we'll get started. So while you wait, answer the trivia question, test your knowledge. There's also a direct link in the chat to Slido too. Might be easier to use your phone, or if you have a separate screen, pull up Slido. This is not the only question that we'll ask today, so it's not a one and done. Okay, we're just about a minute after, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lighting Systems Technology Research Team webinar. The title is How to Weigh Non-Energy Impacts of Your Lighting Controls Project. My name is Axel Pearson, coming to you live from Salt Lake City, Utah. I will be your host today. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you're not sure what the Lighting Systems Technology Research Team is, not to worry, I will cover that in a bit. And if you're not sure what non-energy impacts are, you are in the right place. You joined the right webinar. Either way, I'm glad you're here. I hope we can share some of our knowledge, help add value to your lighting projects, especially beyond the tried and true energy savings of LEDs and controls. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Oh, there's the title slide. Okay, one more. If you joined in time to answer our trivia question and join Slido, the answer is one click. There it is. Answer is B, 5 to 6%. And this comes from research at MIT. They sampled about 5,000 offices in Manhattan and New York City. Let's see how many people got it right. I actually need to log in. I've got Slido here over on my other screen, and hopefully that'll show us, but can we, yes. Ooh, a pretty good spread, but we tricked you. So the answer is 5 to 6%. Many people overestimated the value of daylight when you're renting an office space. So still pretty close, but we are going to talk about this and other non-energy benefits and impacts a little bit later. So congrats to all of you that you got that got it correct. And if you didn't see how to answer that question, if you're just joining, I'll cover how to use Slido in a couple of slides. And don't worry, there are plenty more questions coming, so keep your finger on the trigger and get ready to answer some polls and give us good input. So let's go back. Ooh, I see people are still answering it. Okay, that's cool. Let's go back to the slide deck. And all right, good, we're on this slide. So first, some logistics before we get started. Slides and the recording will be posted shortly after the webinar on the Better Building Solutions Center. if you'd like to navigate there now, go to betterbuildingsolutioncenter.energy.gov, and then you can hover over events and webinars, and then click on on-demand webinars. From there, you can click on lighting under a technology. There's a bunch of technologies. Personally, I recommend lighting is the best one to find this webinar and many more that we've done in the past. And we'll also send out an email to all of you that registered, letting you know that the slides and webinar posting is available online. I'm going to cover questions and answers on the next slide, but you can always reach us at integratedlighting@pnnl.gov for questions and comments. Don't hesitate to shoot an email over there. That one goes directly to my inbox. Happy to help you. I've got a whole bunch of lighting experts at my disposal here at Pacific Northwest National Lab, and they're there to help answer any questions. And I promise you, they really like it when we get them. Okay, next slide. So if you are just joining, didn't do the trivia question, that's okay. We are going to use Slido for polls and question and answer. So hopefully you've all used it before. If not, pretty straightforward. Go to slido.com on your smartphone or a new browser window if you've got a couple of screens. And at the top of the page, you'll just enter DOE into the event code box. And so that's where you can answer our poll questions. And we do have a number of them for you today, as well as Q&A. And so you can answer your questions, and then we'll take some time at the end to review them. There's a ranking function. You can upvote questions. It's pretty cool. So if we don't get to answer all of your questions, we will be sure to follow up with you via email. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, next slide, please. Here is the agenda for today's webinar. I'd like to introduce you to those of us on the webinar today. I'll tell you just briefly about three upcoming events that we're aware of and that we'll be involved with, and hopefully you're aware of. I'm going to take a little bit of time to give you an update on the Integrated Lighting Campaign, which is a similar DOE lighting program if you're not familiar with it, but I hope you are. So I'll tell you a bit about that and our recognized partners. And then we will get into the main attraction of the webinar, which covers non-energy impacts for lighting controls projects. Okay, that's what we've got ahead of us for the next hour or so. Again, feel free to send in questions via Slido as they come in. I'll flash out my contact information at the end, but again, integratedlighting@pnnl.gov. And with that, I'd like to introduce today's speakers. So we'll go to the next slide. Just two of us here today. I am there on the left. Again, my name is Axel Pearson. I'm a project manager here at Pacific Northwest National Lab. I lead the Integrated Lighting Campaign and the Lighting Systems Technology Research Team, and I put on events like this one. On the right there is my colleague, Michael Meyer, senior lighting researcher and one of the top lighting nerds here at PNL, and he'll be covering the non-energy impacts content, and he's going to ask you for your input along the way. So you're going to spend the next hour with us. I hope you're ready. Okay, next slide, please. So moving on to what brings us together today, this webinar is a production of the Lighting Systems Technology Research Team. We aim to reduce lighting use by sharing insights and experiences related to emerging lighting and control systems and documenting solutions. We want to share our work with you and also get your input on how we can help you save energy, improve your buildings, improve your occupants' experience, all through lighting. And this is really intended to be a collaborative effort. And that's why we bring all of us here together and ask you for your input. If there's a topic you're interested in or you want to get involved, and you have a question for the lighting experts here at PNL, let me know, let us know. We'd be happy to talk with you. We love talking lighting. So thank you for joining, and whether you know it or not, thank you for being part of the team. Next slide, please. All right, just a few events that I want to let you know about in case you're not aware of these already. We have the IES Annual Conference coming up in early August. That's held in Schaumburg, Illinois. I personally will be there. I'm going to tell you a little bit about why in the next slide. And then the next event we have is the Design Lights Consortium's Controls Summit. So they gather a bunch of stakeholders from industry to talk about lighting controls. That will be held in Detroit, Michigan, September 26th and 27th. I don't think registration is quite open for that one, but it's opening soon. So if you want to get involved with that, I encourage you to go to DLC's website. And then finally, NALMCO, which is the International Association of Lighting Management Companies, is holding their 70th annual convention and trade show. That is in Indian Wells, California, just outside of Palm Springs, October 8th through 11th. So that will be a good one. If you're itching to go to the desert in California, that's the place to be. Okay, next slide. All right, I mentioned it, on to the integrated lighting campaign. This is my child. I hope you're all familiar with the campaign. If not, just like the name sounds, the ILC recognizes innovative lighting projects that push the envelope in terms of integration, energy savings, novel capabilities, and non-energy benefits and impacts. So we have just made the determination on our recognized partners for this year, the 2023 campaign year. We are recognizing 11 participants. That means lighting projects and 3 supporters. I'm not going to announce them today. This is just a teaser. I'm going to announce them at the IES annual conference that I mentioned last slide. So if you're going to Schaumburg for IES annual, come to our session on Saturday. I'm going to announce and present on our recognized participants. But we'll also be sending out an announcement via email and promoting them over the next few months. So keep an eye out for that soon. One last note, we will be holding another year of the campaign. So next year, if you have a lighting project that you think would be a good fit for the campaign and you want to be recognized, please let us know. I'd be happy to get you set up and get you applied for next year. Okay, next slide, please. With that, I am going to pass it on to my colleague, Michael Meyer, to tell us about non-energy impacts. Take it away, Michael.
Thank you, Axel. And yes, I am a big lighting nerd, or just in general lighting nerd. And this will be pretty interactive today. We are, as Axel alluded to, and some of you have already started using, we will be using Slido a fair amount, trying to get some feedback on some data sets and processes. And I did see 1 or 2 people ask some questions or raise some comments there. So please push them through as they come in, as you see fit. So that way, when we get towards the end of the hour, we either have some feedback, not just questions. We'd also like to hear some of your opinions on whether or not some of the data sets are okay to use, or what concerns you have in processes. Next slide, please. So non-energy impact, non-energy benefit. You've probably heard NEB, which is the abbreviation for non-energy benefit, a little more. The idea there is that we're going to look at a widget or a process and how does it affect the building system, or in this, sometimes it's applied to the utility, and what does it give beyond just energy? And often we thought of, well, let's look at the positive aspects of it, so therefore it's a benefit, and let's try to value and realize those value of those benefits. And so that's where the idea of NEB came out of. It's morphed a little more into this term NEI, non-energy impact. And the reason is that not everything has a positive aspect to it. And then unfortunately, a simple example is advanced controls. Whether or not they be lighting controls or sometimes some advanced mechanical controls, there is an assumption, right or wrong, we can get into that, that it requires more skilled maintenance, or it requires more constant maintenance. And as a result, that increased maintenance is going to be a cost, and therefore it is an impact. And so that's where the idea of an NEI comes from, is that not everything has a benefit. There are some costs that are related to things. So the terms are semi-interchangeable. Again, a lot of shorthand people use NEB, but then again, there are some new researchers who are looking at this concept of the I to really realize that. So let's talk about that. What does an NEI really mean? What is non-energy? So we're looking at how does, again, the widget or the process improve either operational functions, possibly property values, as you saw in that question about daylight and how it affected office premium. And then the holy grail that everybody's desperate to try to figure out is how can we use this widget or process, and how does it affect the productivity or the performance of the occupants in the space? Sometimes people try to lump other things in NEIs, and they're really not as accurate, such as grid or demand response. Those are still really ultimately an energy function. If you do a demand response event, you are saving power and ultimately doing something that's beneficial to the grid. But that's really wrapped up still in that normal energy aspect of it. Similarly, if you're using a lighting system and you're maybe connecting it to the mechanical system to communicate with the mechanical system to set back the temperature, or just looking at the reduced cooling load, again, that's really not non-energy, it's just non-lighting energy. So again, it's not really not NEI. Those both examples are energy related. So just again, way to think about this, the overall bucket of NEI is how the widget or the process improves the space beyond an energy component and energy. And when we look at that, we're looking at operational, property, or productivity. Those are the three main buckets. Next slide, please. Okay, so then we tend to characterize NEIs into three major categories. A fair amount of researchers have looked at this. You typically look at it from a utility point of view, maybe a societal point of view, and then ultimately what they call the participant. I sometimes call it at the building level. The idea with a utility is that they might be valuing an NEI for different reasons, such as if they reduce energy, that might have secondary benefits to them, such as less debt, fewer customer calls, reduced payment arrangements, those type of things. So the utility tends to be interested in NEI, and they may actually value an NEI differently to incentivize participation in a program because they're getting benefit at the utility and at the grid level, separate from the building or the participant. And then you might have what we call the societal ones. So these are greater things than just any of us. And these tend to be the secondary related elements of energy. Maybe it's air quality. So if you have less energy used, your overall air quality tends to be improved depending on the type of power plant that's generating it. You can also have some water quality impacts. So the idea of societal ones, these are again, grand NEI aspects, and you're now recognizing the externality of that and how it affects maybe employment or reduced coal ash. So those are examples of societal. I suspect many of you on this call are probably more leaning towards the participant, or what I look at as the building, the owner, the occupant. Why are they choosing to install possibly this more expensive widget to get some additional benefits beyond just energy savings? And so in this case, you might be looking at operations and maintenance, whether or not the easiest example there is LEDs. They were longer life, and therefore that we have factored that into early cost analysis. It could be something as simple as using lighting controls and a Bluetooth beacon on, let's say, a wheelchair in an airport to help find your equipment. It's reducing the operational cost. So that's an example of operations and maintenance. Could be how you improve property values. The opening slide was about daylight and the effect on rent premium. So in some cases, either the appearance of the light or daylight or some other function might actually increase either the value of the home or the building, and that's might be something. Participant health impacts, that typically leans more towards the IAQ side and air quality, comfort. And then again, as many are interested in, is how do they make building occupants more productive or improve their performance or those type of things. And there's potential where lighting or other IAQ aspects could play a role in that aspect. And many people are looking at that. And then again, that health is tied to maybe reduced hospital time. Time in the hospital has been related to daylight exposure in patient rooms. So again, everyone's trying to look at how can we take that information and convert that into a value to make decisions. Next slide, please. Which should be bringing us to our first Slido poll. So this is a whole list of questions that we're asking you. So I just quickly touched base on what are the main categories of NEIs. We're just trying to gauge your interest. What are you here for? Are you here for maybe utility NEI, and then within the utility ranking, which ones are you interested in? Are you here maybe for the greater societal? And now I see people ranking these pretty quickly. So this is exactly the type of response. And this is why we like Slido. So we've got 2 or 3 people, and this will change in real time. And so tends to be many people are here on the participant level, though we do have some societal level. So we have about 4 or 5 people ranking. So I'll pause for a second. I think the list is about 16 lists deep. Please scroll all the way down in case you'll find it. the Slido that you're looking at populates the top two responses to moves into the top for us. So that's why we're seeing them. You're also seeing it why it's recalculating the numbers overall, is because as we're changing. But so far we've had about 11 people respond to the question. So we'll wait about 10, 15 more seconds, hopefully get this number a little higher in our participation. This is very helpful for us for a couple of reasons. One, it lets us learn more about you. And then ultimately, where we're trying to take some of this research is, how do we take your interests and then tailor some of this NEI related work? Maybe, in this case, let's use comfort as an example. How, if comfort is a large focus of a number of people who are either attending this presentation or who are interested in NEI in general, that allows us to tailor that research. So we've got about 25 responses. Like I said, I'll wait probably maybe another 10 more seconds. I feel that at this point, we're seeing kind of the quick responses where, at a high level, there's a lot of participant level, a few at the societal level of air quality, and a few people are very much interested in some of the benefits on the utility side. I would say the utility side there's a lot of active interest in that area by the utilities and the regulators for these reasons, because they would like to encourage participation in these programs. And so that's why people are interested in it. All right, we'll include these. I don't entirely know how the video works, how we'll dump this information when the final tally comes in, because you can still vote as long as you want. Some of you may be reading more or less. But at this point, we're going to return back to the presentation and move into the next slide. There will be a few more polls as we go, so just keep being good Slido participants. Back to the slide. Okay, so back to another question. So here's the second question. What is the estimated breakdown of workplace costs by salaries, benefit, rent, and utilities? So you have three categories: salaries, rent, and benefit. What are your percentage breakdowns? Let's go back to the Slido poll. So we have some responses coming in. This will be a good leading question to our next slide, so it'll get a sense of kind of where all these break down. Though I feel that we're getting some consensus opinions here. I really do like the Slido process, because you get to see the real-time response, how we're all coming in, and the numbering process. I'm going to just pause while you're doing that. Please keep the questions coming in. If you have webinar-related questions, you can use the Q&A pane. I see someone asking about where the deck will be located, and we'll follow up later with that one. If you have general NEI questions, you can always use the Slido Q&A pane if you have any questions come in. All right, we got about 32 responses. So I would say, looking at this, we have one main answer, but second runner-up. Most people think that it's about a 75% of salaries, 15% is rent, and 6% utilities, and a close second is a 90% in salaries. Next slide, please. So many of you probably are attending this have heard kind of that famous 330-300 rule that was really popularized by LaSalle. They're a commercial real estate building company. Now they tend to think of things in a per square foot basis, because that's how real estate works, and it makes a lot of sense to talk in that sense. And so they set up that simple scale where essentially utilities are your smallest portion, which was the same in the slides that we showed you. And then you have essentially a 10 factor cost increase for rent. And then they suggested that they have about another 10 factor increase for salaries, or the distance between your salaries and your utilities is essentially a 100-to-1 ratio. CBIESE, which is out of Europe, in 2005 did a slightly different approach. And the reason I like this one is that it gives you a percentage of cost of an organization. You as a company or you as an organization probably know what your budget is. And you may think about it in terms of, well, this is how much our operating is, or this is how much money we bring in, or our budget. And it's easier to break it down into these percentages rather than trying to understand what the per square foot relationship is at LaSalle. Now, what you'll notice between these two completely done independent processes is that you're seeing about the rent to utility relationship is about 10-to-1. Then you're also seeing, then what you're seeing is essentially, in this case, the rent to salaries on the left-hand side is essentially about an 8-to-1 relationship, and then from the utilities to salaries is essentially a 185%. So the relationships magnitudes are similar, but I like the one on the left because it allows CFOs and others who know their budget rather than thinking about per square foot, how to break it down quickly. And again, I think these numbers probably have dwarfed a little bit post-pandemic and the restructured work for certain building sectors. There are probably people who are now more on salary and less on rent. And so it'd be interesting to see where this number is, let's say in 2024, being 10 years after the major point of the pandemic. Why does this matter? Probably you know this, but let's talk about it anyways. Utility costs are a small portion. So everyone is trying to think about how can we tap into that greater value potential, whether or not it be rent or whether or not it be payroll. Next slide, please. So let's get into the process. Here's a series of about 9 different studies that were done, different places, different locations, using house premiums on the green high performance metrics. So you can see over here on the left what the sales price premium is and what the ranges are. You can see that we provide you the study name, and then these were done in different locations across the domestic United States. Some are national studies, some are regional studies. And you can see that they've been done over the last 20 years. It's a very tight average though. And the reason I like this is that when we think about NEIs at the building level, they tend to give you more consistent answers than when we get to that human aspect. And the reason is that there's many factors that are going to affect your human performance or productivity. And the numbers tend to be pretty broad ranges. And they also tend to be very hard to monetize. So I like thinking about if we're going to prioritize our NEI work area, looking at that middle band as a starting point is probably the best place to look at is how can we improve on the building operations or the building value for consistent. But we also have to build up this data set of where are we getting this data from and how are we calculating it and how are we using it. Next slide, please. So this is a slightly different. What the previous slide was residential. This is now rental, commercial buildings. Again, you can see over on the left the per seat rental premium as a result of the building, whether or not it being LEED or a few other variations depending on the certification system. Again, these have been done over the last 20 years by different studies. Again, nice consistent range. And real estate has some different ranges. You're always going to have whether or not it be a downturn in the economy, location, those all affect those type of things. But again, you can see kind of this nice clustering of prices or of premiums, again, related to the building level. We have consistent data, and it's easy when we look at those type of things. It gets really hard when we start looking at the performance of humans and all the variables that affect them. Next slide, please. Okay. The other thing that I think is important is to gauge your poll, and people are already responding, so thank you. How many data points? So in those 2 previous examples I showed you, roughly 10 studies that would show you what the premium would be, whether or not you're doing a study on residential or commercial buildings on a high performance certification of that dwelling. And then you'd be able to make a representation about the value that certification gives. So we're here asking you, what would be enough to establish a trend? And this is important because as we start trying to build out this NEI model, which you'll see again in a little bit, this is going to factor in to the workflow as well as the data sets. When we first asked this question, as many as I could get got a lot of votes. Now we're seeing that people really need to see 5 or 10 studies before they would consider that a valid data set to consider how they approximate an NEI for that building. And so this is very informative, again, as we are building out this process to know, okay, we need to focus maybe on certain NEIs to see if we can get these numbers higher, if this is what's going to be the minimum acceptance or comfort level for a data point. I think we kind of get the flow there. Again, it seems to be that a lot of people want somewhere between more than 5, a lot would prefer at least 10, and then some of us will love the more the merrier. Going back to the slides, please. Okay, so let's talk about some of the studies that we looked at and their processes, and then we'll get into our process in a second. So this is a D&V, they're a utility third-party group. They did this work for Puget Sound, which is out of the Northwest. They established a methodology. What they did is they reviewed the published NEI studies. So again, one of the challenges with an NEI process and how you value it is you've got to go out and gather all of those NEI studies so you can document what the numbers are. I showed you those. They developed weights based on confidence factor and plausibility, which you're going to see in the next slide. Confidence. It's a series of questions related to the level of review document. So one of the challenges we have with these NEIs are someone publishes a report, but it may be limited to the Northwest, or it may be limited to primary education, and you're now trying to extrapolate those results. So the idea with the confidence score is, how can that research that I've read, how can I weight that now to apply that to a grander process or to my specific location? Plausibility is a similar idea. Here they're looking at maybe the report was published 5 years ago. What has changed in those 5 years, either to technology or to practices, and would I now weight that differently? As well as they included in the plausibility factor some things related to the technology changes and other factors. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a quick snapshot of some of the underworkings of their slides, of their methodology. I'm sorry, I don't know if you heard me, Anna. Can you go to the next slide? Oh, perfect, thank you. So here you can see the confidence factor over there. So what they do is they ask the reviewer, when they're calculating this NEI process, they ask them these 5 questions. And each question gets a certain level of score from 0 to 3, and then you combine them and you get a weight. And then essentially, so you can see, like, is the measure specific? How was it done? Was it done using a statistical method? Because some of the data we have on NEIs can be really deep into a scientific process with good statistics. Some of it can be pretty broad and just be kind of up in the air saying, well, this NEI improved performance, and not provide a lot of technical background on how it did it or statistical rigor of showing what it was. So here you can weight it. Each question, it has a different series value, then you sum those up, and then ultimately you would multiply that times the NEI that was reported in the calculation below. Similarly, they have a series of questions related to their plausibility factor here. And here you can see where they're going to ask about the age of the study. So in their model of the older the study, the less weight they give it. Ideally, the newer, more fresh research is going to get the higher score because it's hopefully going to be germane to what we've been doing in society at the time. So that's going to build into it. They also looked at what has happened to that technology since it was published. Has it improved itself? And therefore, maybe you should weight it less as a result of that. So the reason I'm trying to show you is that the NEI process involves lots of sub-calculations and lots of questions. You need to evaluate every NEI that you're reviewing and then come up with a weighting factor for each of it. So in this case, D&V's process is you would take the NEI that was found in the previous report, then you would multiply it by a confidence factor that would be determined by you, your site-specific confidence in that report. Then you multiply it by your plausibility factor. How much do I think that this accounts for this new report is based on where we are today, based on what I know about it. And then they also had an economic adjustment where maybe that NEI had a lot of value because it was in, let's say, New York City in the example that we showed with rent, but where you're located in Manhattan, Kansas, it has a different economic value. So you scale it that way. And that's how they got to their NEI process. Next slide. Another example is the study of summary of IEQ studies and productivity. And this is definitely what I've been trying to slow down on. And this is where I think those plausibility and confidence scores really are going to become a question. And that's going to be one of our next poll questions in a second. There's a wide range in productivity. To think that either temperature control or lighting or improved IEQ can boost your performance by 10 or 40%, I'd be very concerned about that analysis, because then either was the sample size small, was it a short duration analysis, or other factors. What would make someone's productivity increase by a factor of 40% just by having access to temperature? I mean, unless it's a really horribly hot space or horribly cold space, productivity tends to be, again, multivariable. And so you want to limit that. But you can see the wide range of the studies because the values on humans, everybody looks there. But again, this is where we need to put the most caution and look at how do we evaluate each of these studies individually and weight them appropriately. Next slide. So then this is another analysis. This was published in 23 at the start of the year. This is a survey-based approach. This was done by the Design Lights Consortium. They hired a third-party group who's very versed in NEI research. There, they found that utility programs value NEIs and cost benefit essentially 2.3 times. That's good. I mean, that's what we like to see. That means for every $1 you're putting in, you're getting about $2.30 back, and that's or value. And they also found that NEI is valued at approximately 11% of full-time staff maintenance. And then they also found building occupants' self-reported productivity improved through network lighting controls. Now, the only caution I would have with this approach is that this is a survey-based approach. And so what they're doing is they're saying, if this control went in, how much would it improve your performance? And you, as the building occupant or building manager, would respond, oh, I think this would have more time or less time for maintenance, or my productivity would be better if I had this control or not. So it is not quantitatively assessed through a rigorous analysis of how much work did we produce over the year. This is a qualitatively a process where I subjectively determine how much I would be improved through its methodology, or through its mechanism. Would lighting controls make me more productive? And that's how I assessed it. And so that's a different way to do it. And so I just want to touch base on this approach. Next slide, please. Okay, so I showed you this already, which already had the IEQ studies and productivity. I just want to kind of mention most of these are done through the quantitative approach, where they're essentially measuring how you perform and what the outcomes are. Next slide, please. So then this gets into, again, that qualitative approach or survey approach. What level of comfort are you going to have? So here's 5-6 studies that show wide range of output. But here's the thing that I want you to think about. These studies go back as far as 1980 to essentially the year after I was born. What has changed since then? The way we work, the lighting situations, everything about that. So how much stock would you put into a data report from 1980 that was done with a duration of 2 days? Would you put more stock in a report, let's say, that was done in 2014 that had a participant size of 49? Or conversely, would you put more stock in a 2002 report, but had 290 participants that went on for 2 months? So again, the challenge we have is we can find examples of NEIs over time from different sectors using different technologies, but then we can't just take that number and say, well, this report found an 8% improvement in productivity, which is what that lighting productivity gain found, by increasing the illuminance, without pausing and say, well, wait a minute, what has changed since 1980? The answer is everything. So how much stock do we put in that answer? That's where the weights come in. That's the idea of the plausibility factor, and that's the idea of the confidence factor that you have to build into this NEI calculation. Next slide, please. So we're now asking a poll. We're trying to understand, and again, this is for us to improve the methodology and help us get rid of certain data inputs. As we're reviewing NEI data inputs, what is your preferred rank of whether it be a survey-based approach, maybe a manufacturer case study, maybe a third-party case study, or do you think, do you prefer it to be a structured journal article that looked at qualitative, methodology where they do a pre and a post, they measure everything. So again, the idea here is I've shown you all the kind of the different data sets examples that get out there and explain to you some of the concerns that other NEIs have looked at of how do you weight the confidence of it or the plausibility of it. Now you as potential buildings or utilities or others who might be implementing an NEI into your value calculation, if you knew that the underlying data was X, how would that affect your answer? And so we're seeing that overwhelmingly, it appears, we've got about 22 responses. Most people have said they want that third-party review data. And then I'm sorry, I said third party, but I really meant peer reviewed is what I meant to say. And then they ranked it second by third-party case studies. And it appears that the least comfortable or least ranked data there would be manufacturer-based case studies. And so this will help us as we build our NEI database, know what to factor into. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'm gonna pause for a second while we load in. Perfect. Okay, so then we have the second question is, can you also rank the data set by importance? So I showed you, our last question was all about how accurate or who did the data set of the NEI. Now, as they start sharing this data, do you consider participant size important, or duration, or the age of the study, or the metric? And the metric could be whether or not they're using illuminance as a proxy for circadian health, or maybe they're using temperature as a proxy for IAQ. That's the idea here. So again, this helps us as we build out this overall process, as well as our NEI data set, to then maybe skew certain inputs related to, this case, studies that only have a sufficient participant size, or younger or newer, I guess when I say younger, studies versus older studies. Seems duration right now is less of a concern. So more important, it seems that if we test this on 100 people, but only over 2 days, people seem to be more comfortable with that than maybe saying testing it on 10 people over 20 days. That'd be an example of this ranking. So I appreciate that. I'm keeping an eye on time as well. And I think we're done with that question. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're moving to the final steps. So this is where we're getting to, and this is kind of where we need your help, and this is what we're looking for. So we have started working on building up this data set of NEIs. We're looking at them. In this case, we tracked, here's the simple example, rent and minimum daylight spatial autonomy. So that was what that first slide was about, was if we increase the daylight in a space, what does your rent premium look like? So that's the type of things that would be captured from a journal article and measured and built into an overall data set. So then we could build this into the calculation. So then we found out to capture the magnitude of the NEI. This, in case, would be a 6% rent pricing premium. You could also capture this with, let's say, IAQ, better or lower CO2 levels, have an improved employee productivity of 4%, whatever the number is. But here you're not only documenting what happened, but also what the outcome was. So in this case, the benefit being a rent pricing premium. So then we answered almost all of our questions for number 3. So weight the data set based on, from what we heard, you want prefer third party, you prefer large occupant or large participant size, and a few other data sets, and we'll build that into our process there. Once you've weighted it, you then identify a representative cost. So in this case, I live in Albany, New York. So I picked the average rent in my location. And so the average current office rent is $19.62 a square foot. So then I would multiply it by the 1.06%, which is my rent increase. And then I showed you these weighting factors, 1, 2, 3, and N. And that's what we're going to hopefully finalize in what these weights actually look like based on the feedback you just gave us. And so the idea there is we'd come up with a standardized process that you would walk through and say, you would answer questions of, did the NEI that you're using have 4 reports that showed similar results? Do they have, can we weight those reports based on age and sample size and those type of things? So you answer those questions, and that's how we would develop those weights. In this hypothetical scenario, I said all those weights reduced to 0.97. So then you can see that in this scenario, if I had a rent in an office in Albany, New York, that met a 55% spatial daylight autonomy, you should be able to actually get a rent premium of $20.17. Now that is less than a 6% increase, but again, that's the whole point of these weights, is that the reference document gave us one number, but that number is only applicable to really that report at one point in time. And then you build all your weights to factor in how to either change its location or change all the variables that you need to change. And then you get essentially the cost for your location, or the benefit for your staff, or what the improvement in X would be. Next slide, please. So, as I've mentioned, this is where no one has queued into the Q&A and discussion, but we'd love to hear your thoughts here. These are our kind of next big hurdles that we're locking into, is determining the weighting factors and the ranges. How many questions should we ask? What would be an acceptable number? Is 5 weights acceptable, or do people think that, hey, I can only spend 10 minutes on this task, we can only ask 3 questions, and what would they be? I've talked about the polls, which you guys have helped, and we're going to take and we're going to build into our process. What did we miss? What type of things do you think should be considered? We talked about the size of the study, the type of the NEI that we found, the number of reports that showed that same value. We talked about duration. We talked about the methodology. What did we miss? Sarah, can see some questions coming in here, so I'll look at those. So thank you for those questions. What applications should we be looking at? Now, again, we went really high level with this presentation. We talked about rent, and we talked about loosely on productivity and student performance. We gave that example of wheelchairs and the lighting sensors. What type of applications are people looking for? Where do they feel the NEI is either ready to be grabbed and we just need to build it out, or is an untouched area that hasn't been looked at? And then finally, the question that we're desperate to get someone to answer is, we've built this methodology out, we're building it out even better. How would your organization, your utility, your building, your school build this into a financial calculation? So if I'm going to put a color tuning system in, say, a classroom, how did you get your school district CFO, or whoever the correct person is, to approve spending more money than a standard lighting system? Because you said, well, here's the benefit. We showed you the calculation. Now we want you to spend a little more money because we're going to get this value, but it's hard to translate value to real dollars to financial people. So the question is how would your organization do that? We're desperate for that feedback. While we've got some questions, I'm going to look over here. Would it be possible to build this proposed process into a calculator to be used into evaluating design options? I think that's an interesting question. I think we could develop a concept and then maybe a modular aspect that would allow for it. And then I think, actually, the next slide is the discussion panel, so I should invite you in. I just get so enthused by Q&A and I just jumped into it. I apologize.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, you're right on. Yeah, thank you, Michael. That was great. Yeah, so we are now in the question and answer phase. So Michael, you answered one, but now is the time. If you've been holding a question, go ahead and enter it into slido.com. Again, if you still need to get there, you can use that QR code. You can go to slido.com and then enter the participant code DOE. There are links in the Zoom chat sent by our tech support, Anna. So yeah, go for it. And it also doesn't have to be a question. If you have some input to some of those questions that Michael was just asking on those discussion points last slide, just throw it in there and we can discuss. I know that these webinars don't give us a really good way for two-way communication, but we will use Slido as best we can. So with that, let's go into the next question. So are there certain regions of the US that have more NEI studies than others, Michael?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in 1 second. Actually, sure. I would like to say, though, could we also go back to that other question? Because I'd like to expand on the calculator question to the audience.
Sure.
In terms of NEI studies, yes, there are more regions. I feel that the Northwest has done a little more work in this area. I think the real question is when we need to get specific on the NEI study. When you say more NEI studies, are you talking specifically, let's say, about lighting, or are you talking more specifically at the utility level or the building level? residential sense, again, as I showed you all those examples, those tend to be populated a little more on the East Coast. That's because some of the certification organizations related to residential tend to be located out here, and they've also got some other reasons why they did it, just because of geography. But in terms of utility level, who spent a fair amount of time in this area, I do tend to see again more on the East Coast and the Northwest who are looking into it. I think some of that's trying to increase their participation in their existing programs. I think that relates to some regulatory reasons. But then if you want to, again, when you say NEI studies, those things that I'm referencing a lot of those are really related to the valuation of the NEI. If you're just looking at a high level question of what NEI data research exists, that tends to be across the country where people have looked at whether it be how many days in an hospital does someone stay because of daylight. Those tend to be more regional based on where they're located and things like that. There's a plethora of studies out there in the IEQ world that have looked at what are the benefit or the impacts of the non-energy impacts. The valuation is still the thing that's not standardized. So it would be really helpful to qualify the productivity loss associated with poorly implemented lighting control systems. Yeah, I mean, in general, when we get into productivity, everyone should get a sense in their head that you're talking small numbers. You're talking, 1 to 10 to 15%. Anything beyond that, you've got a bigger problem. I mean, we know from vision science that you can do a fair amount of performance under low light. So that's where that is, as well as we know there's a huge number of factors that affect performance and productivity. And one of the challenges with productivity research and why I'm always nervous to approach it is it's twofold, is that unless you can show a true widget output of I sewed this many shirts an hour, it's hard to convert that into office settings or teaching settings. You can't really say teachers teach more in good lighting, or a lawyer can write more briefs in good lighting. So you run into how do you, they tend to use secondary metrics of, in this lighting condition, people were able to do word searches faster or number cross checks faster. And while that is easy to do research, it is very hard to take that example and extrapolate that out to your normal job. So like I say, and I would say the other challenge with productivity is how do you monetize 3% of someone's job? How do we say, well, in this example, poor lighting design, whether it be contrast or glare, resulted in a 7% reduction in productivity. 7% is a small number. So it's not like you can really eliminate an employee or add an employee. So how do you monetize those type of things? It's still the question. Again, we can do it mathematically. We can take your salary, we can do all those, and we can say, well, based on this, it's this poor lighting is costing you $12,000. You can do it algebraically. It's not hard. But then how does your CFO appreciate that is the question when some of these productivity numbers. What top 3 NEB control strategies are being adopted across the country by vertical market or segment? I don't know if we have good data on what strategies are being adopted. And from a lighting control point of view, really the lights are everywhere. So everyone is really trying to tap into the space utilization, and a little less so now with COVID concerns being different that they are. There was kind of some of the contact tracing. I would say schools are very interested pretty much across the country in different reported of color tuning, whether or not it's good for conditioning children. And bright light, we do this, low light, and maybe warm color is when we kind of are relaxing. And so I know at least 3 different school projects, I think 2 of them that Axel shared with me, of schools looking at color tuning. And again, more not for an improvement in educational performance, but more of a conditioning of, well, the students know when the lighting system is this, they can be loud and boisterous, and when it's quiet, or when it's a lower lights of and a bright and warmer tone, they know it's quiet meditation reading kind of phase. So so I would say that's an example. Color tuning, I would say by far is really in the educational setting. Color tuning has got limited experience uptake in the office setting, but from the controls point of view, really, what else can you do with those sensors, whether or not it be asset tracking or space utilization? The spatialization from the office sectors that I've met with and chatted with is the data is confusing what to do with. How do they make decisions kind of long term, 3-4 years, and having that spatialization data now is not when they make their decisions. And so how do they build that process out? I think that's the best answer. It's a good question. It's worth asking about, looking into a little more. So thank you. Wouldn't a simple payback with NEI in illustrating the shortened payback be a good addition to gaining confidence? So the person who asked this question about an NEI with a simple payback, I agree. Again, the challenge is that most financial people, energy is a cost. I can point to where it's saved. Staff FTE time in maintenance, because for mechanical equipment like AFDD, through that you can point to, well, we had 4 service calls with automatic fault detection. We had 2 service calls. You can monetize that and you can point to that easier. Where you start running into some of the challenges of the NEIs are, how do you have the data on what is the cost of finding wheelchairs in an airport? We know it helps, but has anyone actually figured out what that actually costs to a CFO? Or as I say, when you get to that actual true performance and we say, well, this improved productivity, how do you monetize a small portion of someone's salary? See, that's where the CFOs tend to get into less confidence, but that's what we're looking from you. Tell us what your organization, how would they treat this data, and how would they build that into a calculation? Do studies typically take into account just one perspective, or should they ideally for example, increase from means 8% in pocket for owner and perhaps 10% out for pocket for 10%? I'm sorry, I read that quietly to myself. I think that's a great question. And I think that's a prime example of why it's called an NEI that I didn't think about. Yes, this example of rent, the owner's getting more, could get more money. The tenant is now paying more money, and you could conversely say, well, are we seeing a increase in performance because of daylight in those spaces? So I think that's a good question. No, typically most studies tend to look only at a population and not looking at the flip side of who may be possibly other affected of that. That's not always, the studies don't always do that, but the valuation could possibly look at how it affects both sides. But that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. Another concern is the homogenization of working populations relative productivity. There must be a way to diversify or partition work pool rather than simply aggregating them as a single sample. Better, you have a problem in mind. Yeah, productivity in lighting, I mean, if you go all the way back to the 20s and Hawthorne, it's something that lighting has been looking at in productivity, honestly, for 100 years. It is, this person highlights at least one, if not many of the problems related to it. A true productivity study really needs to have separated groups, longitudinal. There's a lot of things there. And again, to suggest that lighting controls or quality of lighting are going to have a major improvement on productivity, and I gotta say major, 10, 15% or more, the lighting conditions have to be pretty poor because, again, there's so many other factors in productivity. So, but they are productivity studies are really hard.
Awesome. That is just about perfect timing. We are out of questions now, but if you still have a question that you haven't had a chance to ask, or maybe you're noodling on this a little bit later, feel free to shoot me an email. There's my email on the screen. Also, integratedlighting@pnnl.gov. All goes to the same place. I will get in touch with Michael and we'll get back to you with an answer to your question. But now I think I'm proud to wrap it up at this point. Michael, thank you so much for your time and expertise on this fascinating presentation. Thank you all for your great questions. That was a great discussion session at the end. If you can't tell, Michael likes talking about this stuff. If you want to get in touch, please do so. So with that, I will just go ahead and say thank you so much for your time. Keep an eye out for more webinars from our technology research team, and we'll keep this going. Thanks very much. Have a good rest of the day.